by saying, Sarah, thank you so much for agreeing to join us for an episode of The Responsible Edge today. I know you're a very busy woman and you've got lots on your plate, and you've given up some of your time to join us. So I really, really appreciate you doing so.
My absolute pleasure. Great to be here with you.
Fantastic, fantastic. So Sarah, I know that we're not going to be able to do justice to your career in 20 minutes. It's going to be an absolute, how we're going to do this, I don't really know. But let's start by introducing our listeners to you and your background, specifically, obviously relating to our show. I'd love to hear, what were the kind of inspiration points and the motivations behind why you've chosen to follow the career that you have. Feel free to start wherever you like. Some of our guests go like way back, and we go into childhood and etc. Some start a little bit later with higher education or into their career. But just talk us through those early inspirations and what led on from there.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. I will actually start with my childhood. Now, for me, and it's genuinely who I am. The thing where I feel most lucky about what happened in my life, apart from having my children, is I grew up in West Berlin. And when I was 18, the Berlin Wall came down. And contrary to what you may hear, what you may read, none of us saw it coming. And you can imagine being at such a impressionable age, seeing that change can happen. And in the end, how you show up, you can really change and you can drive impact. So I think it's really core of who I am and how I see the world. And since then, whatever I've done in my career has really been focused on believing that change is possible. How I do it, where I do it may have changed, but that intrinsic belief is really true to my purpose. And I also, however hard it can be to drive organizational change or work in sustainability, as everyone who does knows, it's not an easy career. It can be very rewarding and fulfilling, but it can sometimes feel quite daunting. I always think, well, the Berlin Wall came down, anything can happen. So I feel very lucky about that, and I think it's really shaped who I am and how I view the world.
Sarah, it's an amazing sort of place to start. Out of interest, and I want to go through your career and go through the chronology of it, but the impact of that sort of experience on a young, sort of impressionable 18-year-old, if you like, has that light burnt brightly for you in terms of sort of activism, in terms of what's possible throughout the rest of your life and career?
Absolutely, because as I was trying to say, is change is possible. Nobody expected ever for the Berlin Wall to come down. It was going to be there forever. It was totally accepted throughout my childhood that this is the way the world has to be. And then really what felt very dramatic pretty much overnight, during very, very short period of time, the world that I grew up in utterly changed. And we can now look back and say, what has worked, what hasn't worked. But for that period was just the most extraordinary positive change that was driven by what felt like people's activism and people belief. It was a peaceful transition, which is absolutely extraordinary. So I think the possibility of driving change, having impact, has been very much part of how I've approached my career.
And just to get your comment, I think this is fascinating. Just get your comment. Since the burn, and I know you were within the vicinity, you were very much affected by it. But thinking about other global events since it's 1989, isn't it? The Berlin Wall came down correctly. Since then, have there been, in your mind, any other events that have been akin to what happened there?
So it's an interesting question. My point would be, the reason why I'm picking on that one is because it felt so personal. It's different from reading about it. And I do find it when I especially talk to my now grown up kids about it, it's very hard to convey what it was like, because it was such an odd way to grow up. And there's so much you can bring it to life because it feels absolutely crazy. With hindsight, and I also feel really lucky because there are two things that I understood, which are very hard to read about. You actually have to live through. One is, as I said, change can happen.
Hmm.
peaceful change can happen. I saw it with my own eyes. And the other one, I had my freedom, my personal freedom, because I grew up in West Berlin. But clearly, people in East Germany didn't. And seeing that first weekend, what that meant for them is so extraordinary. So I feel very, very privileged, because I do feel I understand what freedom is. Because privilege, of course, is one of these things that when you have it, you cannot really intellectually and emotionally understand it. It's not really possible. Whereas me being so close to seeing what it did to others that didn't have it, um, is really profound. And this is why I'm still like, after all these years, when you ask me what shaped my career outlook or purpose, it is that, which I think experience it like that clearly is different to reading extraordinarily moving, developments elsewhere in the world, but then you're still reading about them. It's different because you don't see them.
You saw the faces that first weekend of the people
Yeah.
that were affected by this, and that is going to stick with you for forever. It's an absolutely beautiful place to start, Sarah. I love and mean that with all sincerity. It's such a it's such a compelling start to your journey, if you like. Let's move forward then. So you're 18. This has just happened.
And then
You're
I moved to the UK. I moved to the UK, and because I was very politically motivated and interested, I
Mhm.
came over to this country to study and started off my career in journalism, but very focused then on political journalism. But then again, because that's about driving change, and then worked for the last Labour government as a special advisor to someone called David Miliband. Um, and then changed tack in terms of 15 years ago or so. I've held a number of senior roles in corporate sustainability. But I think what's the red thread throughout is that desire to drive change and the desire to, shape living for the better and have a positive impact. And for me is where in the end and how you do that, whether, some people may want to do that through journalism or through government or through business, NGOs. It doesn't really matter. What matters really is the mindset that you want to drive impact so that the outcome and the way that we live is better. So my vehicles have changed, but my mission has never changed.
And that's super interesting, Sarah. Super interesting. But I do want to just touch upon, and again, I think you've provided such a succinct synopsis of that big body of your career. But thinking back to your time working in politics and then going into the private
Mm,
sector, like what taking your point that there is that commonality, if you like, of impact and of
mm.
seeking to make change and to influence change. But what were the major differences for you, and what led you to make the decision to leave the political arena and move into the private sector?
God, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I'm now speaking with hindsight as well. I mean, first of all, working government is an absolutely extraordinary privilege. And I was for 1 year at DEFRA, and then for nearly 3 years in the Foreign Office. I also feel very lucky that I work in government before social media had really arrived.
Okay,
So,
interesting.
when I think, my experience clearly is very different to working there now. I think it's much harder to pursue policy. There's much more distraction. Also, it's far more hostile. So I think it's in that respect, it felt very protected. But I think the biggest difference really in some respects is the level of scrutiny even then. And you
Mhm.
already see it now with the Labour government in the first few months. When you look at the pressure that came and the clothing allowance or whatever, it's a totally different level of scrutiny and pressure you're facing every day, even before social media. So now that must be intensified. And I think certainly my experience working for companies or in corporate is that pressure clearly is there when it comes to financial results. But on a personal level, it's certainly government is on a different level. Apart from that, what I would say is, having worked for many big organizations in the Foreign Office, saying even a global organization, is actually they have more in common than you think. There's a level to dysfunctionality. I think when any organization gets above a certain size and driving change and having the local versus global and the tensions and creative tensions that they are, actually, I think there's more that is translatable, and how you drive change is true in any organization. I think whether it's government or business is more similar than you'd think.
Super interesting. And the point being is that it's really about the scale and the size of the organization, not necessarily the nature of it, in the sense of,
yeah, and then you need mission, and you need to embed it, and how you influence without authority. All of that is true wherever you work, I'd say. And I'm sure that if you work for a large NGO, they would say the same.
Super interesting. Okay, well, I want to dive into a little bit more detail, give our listeners a bit more detail about sort of what happens. Oh, because out of interest, what just so that we can factor that social media point in. When did you leave government?
2010, just before the election year.
Okay, so there was obviously presumably these things. Was that part of your decision making, that you started to see the influence of social media?
No. I mean, partially. I could have stayed working in politics. I mean, it was quite likely we were going to lose the election, but I think because of the personal scrutiny, and because the pressure is at very high level, and also when you work in government, it is so all-encompassing, because you really feel like you're fighting the good fight. We may look back over the last few years and having lost the belief in politicians, but you go into it to drive change, and you believe it 24/7, and that, of course, is exhausting. So I think after 4 years, I personally felt like I wanted to do something different, because you're on all the time, because you believe it all the time, because that's what you go into government and politics for, is to change it. So it's not like, your downtime becomes less and less. So I just felt like I've made the contribution that I felt I was capable of making. And then it was just time for someone else to take over.
And then, and that's brilliantly described. And then talk me through that first role. What the next thing that you did after you
I
left?
worked for a company called Mars. Of course, in the UK here we know the Mars bar, but it's an absolutely extraordinary company, and its confectionery business is just one part of it. A hugely successful business is also there. I think it's called pet care business now. So, the Mars family way back then pretty much, I think, invented pet food, but clearly have got amazing knowledge, and also increasingly moving into, veterinary services and the rest of it. And then there's a food business as well. Fascinating company. It's still family health. It's American, but has got a very big footprint in the UK. And yes, it's absolutely interesting, because when I first joined, there's always this joke. The company is headquartered in McLean, Virginia. And the big joke is the CIA is not the most secretive organization in McLean, Virginia. And clearly that has shifted quite a lot. And you see how Mars, over the last 15 years, has really, put itself out there in terms of advocacy, in terms of, partnerships, and really pushing the boundaries when it comes to sustainability and engagement. But at the time when I was interviewing for the role, there barely was a website, because, of course, corporate reputation, when you're a private company, you could argue is optional, because, you don't have that shareholder pressure. So it was very, very exciting first. I remember one of my first role was to help put together, or to lead the team to put together their first sustainability report, which doesn't seem such a big deal, but at Mars, because they hadn't really communicated in that way before, was a really big part. And out of that then was what became apparent is like, well, when we benchmark ourselves with other companies, maybe, what is the sustainability infrastructure and architecture that we want to build in terms of policies and strategies. Clearly, it always been very, very proactive on cocoa, because, it has all these iconic brands like M&M's and Mars and the rest of it. But it was really pulling it together to the next level. So I was part of that team and had a number of roles, first in the group team, so to speak, and then took a more I guess, closer to the business in some respects, role, reporting into procurement for what was then the chocolate business. And it was a great place to work. Yeah, I did that for 7 years or so. And it's very entrepreneurial, still has that feel. It's very non-hierarchical. So I think we were also lucky working in sustainability and probably being given a lot of freedom to work on projects, and perhaps in a company that is a PLC would have been we would have been more reined in. So it was a fantastic experience.
And Sarah, that was described beautifully. So you joined Mars in around 2010, is that right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So out of interest, and I always love getting the perspectives of people that work in
Mm-hmm.
sustainability over that sort of period of time. How have things changed since your early days at Mars to now, would you say? What have been the key differences? I know that the context has changed because you're working in different companies, but
Yeah,
your overarching impression of the sustainability agenda, what are the kind of key highlights for you?
I mean, I think it's a totally different role. What I think, first of all, we, certainly in 2010, sustainability people, it was very much in the operational, what can you do with your own manufacturing, and the idea of having a responsibility for scope 3 emissions, and how companies play in that space was very ill-defined. I think then very quickly, because Unilever and Paul Polman moved really the needle in terms of what the expectation from business is. But then we moved quite quickly into a space where companies made big declarations.
Mm-hmm.
Even though, the classic thing is like, we don't know how we're going to achieve it, but like, let's put it out there. And clearly that with CSRD and other pressures nowadays is not credible anymore. But I think it was needed at that particular point. So 15 years ago, many businesses didn't even have a sustainability strategy. I think the other point, talking about CSRD, which is very different, is that expectation that sustainability data should be as robust as financial data. And you can say increasingly some sustainability functions say, well, more it moves into finance and legal and the way we treat risk, and all of that is good. Strategy shouldn't be driven by it, but the fact that it's robust and embedded in the business, and not just an outlier with like big sustainability teams that are an ivory tower. I think that's the biggest shift for the better. I think there are also risks, but on the whole, I think when I look back, certainly sustainability teams were very separate from the business. And I don't think they were really embedded in business processes. I think they were separate processes that were set up. And then the realization came that if you really want to move the needle, you need to incorporate them in the way that you do business and the way you report against them. I think the risk we all now have potentially that it could lead to us limiting our ambitions. And I think you've seen a little bit of that of Unilever, you've seen a little bit of Volvo, but and that's good and bad. But I think, looking now where we are, that would be my biggest observation.
And Sarah, interesting. If I was to pick out then from moving on from Mars to Unilever, etc., was there a particular time when you saw those changes beginning to occur? Was there a particular point that you recall?
I think what I just described now is the last few years. So in 2017, I then moved from Mars to Unilever, and Unilever, of course, have been a game changer when it comes to advocacy and partnership and the expectation of what businesses can do. But clearly also have recently realized their limits when it comes to their own commitments and brands with purpose. Like, can all brands have purpose? And is there a danger that you become distracted? And what really is the most material to your business? And I think that shift really has happened, I'd say, in the last 3 to 5 years. That the idea of making big, bold claims is not necessarily seen as something that is ambitious. But, coming to your work, it might also not, maybe greenwashing is a bit harsh, but certainly doesn't carry the same weight, or, it doesn't impress anymore, because people are like, well, but we know that's impossible. Why would you make a commitment you're not going to keep? Because you always say you make stretching commitments to drive the right internal changes, for example. But if it doesn't, then what is it for? And I think that's becoming far more nuanced. That is it. How do you actually drive change? And probably setting more manageable targets is more likely to deliver the right behavior than something that's so out there that people are not even engaged by it.
Sarah, that's super interesting. It's almost like going back to sort of 2010 at the beginning of your time at Mars. There was setting of those kind of objectives in order to like stimulate thinking, excitement around look at the things that we could possibly try and do. And then over the course of that period of time, there's a sense of slight apathy developing towards the nature of the claims and the objectives that organizations are setting, and suspicion. And that's why we now need to adopt this new approach, which is very much more sympathetic to that.
Yeah, and I think there's a danger, because, I mean, what's the definition of a target if it all becomes too achievable?
True.
It's not really a target. It's a, going back to conversation we had before the recording about gyms. I mean, it's on the other hand, if I say, like, do that by 2040, I want you to, achieve this, then, like, is it actually going to drive the desired change? So I think it's a balance. I'm not sure all of us have figured it out, to be honest. But I think this is what's needed for us to continue to drive meaningful change.
Super interesting. I love that, and it relates perfectly to some of the stuff that we've picked up with signatories of the charter. Let me ask you, Sarah, as expected, we've absolutely obliterated 20 minutes talking about you, and we've really only touched the surface. I want to, though, ask you a question that we ask most of our guests now. When you get to the end of your career and you look back on what you've done, what do you want to be able to say about what you did?
I think for my sustainability related part, I want to have some tangible examples where projects that I have led delivered meaningful impact. I've got a nice example at Mars when I pioneered a program that is now, like, since I've left, like, has been built up, but in terms of women empowerment of cocoa farmers, where you feel like, because I drove that, there is improvement in people's lives, or in terms of commercializing sustainability now at Electrolux, where you think, because I was there, a business process, or there's a business program that I can look at myself and say, okay, something, people's lives got better, or business changed as a result of it, because that's in the end why we do it. Another piece for me that is important as I progress in my career and get older is also being a female leader, because when I started out, there weren't very many, and there weren't very many that had children, and there weren't very many that you would aspire to want to be. And I hope as I get older that that's a legacy as well, that at least the generation that comes after me realizes you don't have to outdo the men in aggression, and you can have children, and you can have empathy, and that doesn't make you a less effective leader. If anything, it makes you a different, or even arguably a better leader.
Very much arguably. Hear to that, Sarah. Hear to that. Let me ask you: Are you involved in any, like, mentoring work, or any other sort of, how does that play out? Do you do anything to facilitate that further?
Well, I hope I give that reassurance to my own team and the female colleagues that I work with, or I meet through my network. I hope that they would feel like, that mentoring is there for them.
I love it. Well, that's a brilliant place to close the chapter on getting to know you, Sarah. Thank you for being so open and sharing that with us. And I think actually one comment I would make is, even looking at what you described there in terms of the end of your career and wanting to be able to see that practical output, if you like, and impact the work that you're doing, it very much does lead back to that early formative experience of the Berlin Wall and the sort of practical lived reality that you had when you saw change happening peacefully in that sense. So yeah, really nicely kind of packaged together. Let's move on to today's article. So I think it was John Izzo in Sustainable Brands back in August 2016, which is super interesting for us to have a reflect on its relevance. But would you mind, Sarah, by just summarizing the piece for our listeners and perhaps then just pulling out whatever the most interesting pieces were for you?
Yeah, and I just, if I may, I just want to explain why I feel so passionate about it. So I now work for a company called Electrolux, which is a big Swedish appliance maker. And interestingly enough, very different from FMCG, our biggest impact is post-purchase. So globally, with the current energy mix, 85% happens once I sold you the product. So it's not just, please, can I persuade you? And, it doesn't take our responsibility away from how we source it, how we make it. But clearly there is, first of all, persuading, being competitive to persuade you to buy the most energy efficient appliance out there. But then we also know from all the research that we've done, and I am so guilty of this, and is that, people buy, it's often, especially when it comes to washing machines or dishwashers, is often a distress purchase. So you go into the shop or you go online, you just need something that works, that is at the right price point. You won't compromise on quality. So I think it's very important. It's for, in some respects, I think we're more like the automotive industry, is like sustainability is not going to be a driver. Energy efficiency, yes, but most of all, it's quality and price point. And then you get the manual, and then we all have this drawer in our kitchen where we put these manuals in, and you never look at them again. So you may have a really energy efficient appliance that you bought because you care about your wallet, but also the planet. But then you haven't actually paid attention how to use it. And we've done so much research, like literally asked 14,000 people in 14 countries in Europe. And most of the way that you use an appliance is because, let's face it, how your mother used it. And it's an autopilot. It's not something that it's not food, it's not clothing, it's not something you overthink. You probably do in between podcast recordings. So I think for us, it's so important, because if it's the biggest impact, then clearly for us to be able to deliver against our promises in terms of science-based targets and how we want to decarbonize our company, it's crucial we get that bit right. And going back to my earlier points in my career, I always find the consumer so fascinating, because of course the consumer and the voter are the right people. So I read a lot of research that says people really care about sustainability, they want to close the green gap. But I'm also aware when you ask people in politics what they care about, is not always how they vote, and that's human behavior. And I think we just if I ask, do you care about sustainability, of course you want to say yes. So sorry for the long introduction, but I think this is why the article is so interesting, because what it's arguing really is you need to make it effortless. And you yes, because of all the reasons I've just described. So there the point is, and I think we see it in all sorts of industries and spheres of life, is to make the good, or quote sustainable option, the default option. So you have a lot like with if you think about financial sustainability, like with pensions, the opt-in, opt-out. But clearly then there are very good examples that the article gives in terms of what was like hand dryers versus paper towels. But for us, of course, is you could say, okay, if you want to everyone to wash at 30 degrees, why don't you make it the default? And if you say your washing machine can do everything at 30, then it could do at 60 or 40, and it makes such a difference, then why do you have the other options at all? Would be the logical conclusion, wouldn't it? And then the truth is, what I think where this article is so interesting is because, of course, there's an element of consumer acceptance and nudging the right behavior, and clearly making something a default is a really, really nice and good way of me requiring that something that you do on autopilot you would actually change, and the chances are that you don't. And I think that's the really interesting piece about the article, because that's hugely relevant for us. Because yeah, as I said, like, appliances are 30% of your domestic footprint in your home. So, for us to help you through our UI UX, through default options, to do the most energy, the most sustainable option clearly helps you hugely. Because the truth is, even though it saves people money, they still, because they do it on autopilot, don't always wash their 30 when they could, or they could even steam their clothes. They don't even have to wash them anymore.
You mentioned that, I think, on our first call together, which fascinated me as I went home thinking about my own washing habits. What are I know sometimes we focus in on the article a lot, but I'm really interested in hearing your practical experience of these things. Like, what are some of the sort of most difficult status quo behaviors, if you like, that you've had to encounter on the appliance side, and how have you gone about coming up with a solution to affect behavior and make and encourage the right or the good or the sustainable activity?
Yeah, so I think the biggest, as I said, the biggest issue is that it's not top of mind. Because if you wash at 30 rather than 40, not only will it reduce your CO2 footprint and in terms of water and everything else by 30%, it will also save you money. So you'd think it should be a really easy conversation, because it's a win-win. And once we get people's attention and explain this, and I mean, there have been a number of campaigns, not just from us, but also from others, people change their behavior. But it's just because, behaviors, as you know, are deeply embedded, deeply ingrained, and not overanalyzed. You're doing it just because it's always been like that. You don't overanalyze it. So I think for us, the biggest challenge is how do you create that conversation? How do you create that conversation that you're trusted enough that actually people will say, okay, I'm going to try this out. So I think one big piece is human-centric design. So how can you nudge behavior? How can you bring it to life on product? Either, I think default option, going back to the article, a really good example, or, you can use leaves, that if you reduce your temperatures, or, you use the appliance in the most energy efficient way, you have green leaves, you give these pointers so that people know what is the best option. And we've got like a dishwasher where it's a slider, and it shows you the longer the cycle, the better for your energy efficiency. So the more sustainable the option is. Now, you may not always have the time to say, okay, I want this wash to be like 3 hours, but at least I'm educating you through human-centric design to know the impact. Because again, the assumption is you're doing it on autopilot. So you're just pressing a button while you're talking to someone. So I think there is a lot in design. And then the question is, in terms of advocacy and partnerships, are we perhaps missing a trick here where we can really create momentum for not just us to have the conversations, but also, join forces with, fashion labels or others, or when it comes to food waste, what type of partnerships can we have to really, elevate the message?
Can I, Sarah, that was brilliant. And I feel for anyone out there that's thinking, right, we need a plan for how we can, strategic planning and thinking around how we do this. You've just provided a brilliant little synopsis for people to take away. Let me ask you a question. From my reading the article, and again, I might have got this completely wrong, which we'll edit out if it's the case. It was almost arguing that for a period of time, obviously leading up to the article, there's a lot of work being done into trying to convince the customer, the user, essentially to make the right choice. But the article itself seems to suggest that actually the alternative is to not make it a choice, but to make it the default, and therefore you're not necessarily choosing, just engaging by default in that way. What are, from your perspective, the I mean, because I guess from a really layman's perspective, that seems like, well, that's a brilliantly easy way of resolving the issue, because then you don't even need to convince somebody to do the right thing. It just is the default. But equally, there are challenges obviously associated with that. There are the status quos, there are the ways that we expect to be able to engage with things, the options that we have with perhaps other products.
It's consumer acceptance. That's the point. That's
Right.
exactly the point. I mean, and that's why, the best thing that we can do is through, the user interface, through UI, UX, increasingly as we have connected appliances. Is there a nice way on the app to bring it to life for you, to keep the conversation going with you? But I think the truth is, rightly or wrongly, consumer expectation at the moment is to have the choice. And if you take that choice away, they're not going to engage with you because that's what they want. And that doesn't mean it couldn't change over time. But I think given that what we said earlier, you don't at the moment necessarily have the emotional connection with an appliance that you have with an item of clothing or something else. That's quite a big jump that I'm like now changing the way you should use them, even though you haven't even thought about it. So I think it's just too big a jump. But I mean, from a sustainability point of view, yes, really attractive, but you just have to take people on the journey with you.
And that was going to be my next question. So I love the description that you have of these dashboard elements, these UX and UI elements, to encourage the thinking about my behavior and stimulate me to see the benefit in engaging with the product in this way. Is the ultimate outcome, with perhaps supplementing that with collaborations, advocacy, like building a real swell of opinion around, always using 30 as opposed to any other temperature on your washing machine? Do you see the ultimate outcome being that we could get to the point where we have the just the default option being the sustainable option? Or is
Well, I mean, your ultimate goal would be that you're so persuasive that people just do it, because don't forget, it does save you money. So it's, you're going back to politics. I'm a big believer in behavioral economics. So it seems, so I'm not just saying do it for the planet. I'm just saying do it. There's so many reasons that you will benefit from it. I think so, one way or the other. I think making it the default option is one lever in your toolbox, but it's not the only one, because we're just not there yet. So I think you need more than that.
And that's where, and I want to come on and ask you about this. It's fascinating. We've had lots of conversations on this podcast, people talking about the need for collaboration and cross-sector collaboration, cross-organization, competitive collaboration, etc. But to talk about collaboration within the realms of producing communications campaigns designed to raise awareness of issues and encourage a change of thinking and behavior, that's fascinating. Can you touch on, sort of throughout your career, perhaps some examples of things that you've done like that?
Yeah, I mean, like on this specific one, you could see, like, individual markets have done really nice collaborations with influencers or with fashion show, or we work a lot with chefs.
Okay, yeah, nice.
When it comes to the way you cook your food and you steam and food waste, so I think that's a good space. But I think the company that really has been absolutely brilliant when it comes to using collaboration and partnerships is Unilever. Also, in unlocking donor funding, in working together with partners to address systemic issues. I really think Unilever, I remember at the time I was responsible for a partnership they did with their brand Walls, which I think they're now selling off, their biggest ice cream brand. Driving for more sustainable vanilla in Madagascar, working with suppliers, working with the German government, working with Save the Children, where you really start seeing how these partnerships aren't easy, because they're very different cultures in terms of the organizations, but it really needs that level of collaboration across the board to really drive change. Now, of course, that's very different because you're working in sourcing, and you see, again, Mars and other companies, what they have been doing in cocoa, again, is really start addressing these issues on a systemic level. But I think, as I said, with ours, which is a bit different at the moment, because you're trying to drive change in consumer behavior, it's more like, how do you elevate your voice, I guess, because if people don't feel so strongly about the brand that makes their appliance, which they might not, let's be honest, then who do you work with to start being part of the conversation? Because clearly, the more space you get for that, the better. And that's, I guess, also, and you asked me earlier what the big difference is with government. I think even when I work in government all these years ago, you get given a lot of space for your messaging. And still then it's very hard to drive change, but you do have access to broadcasting. You do have access all the time to put ministers out there, to put experts out there, to explain why a certain policy is necessary or not. Companies don't get that. And very, very few brands have the influence. I mean, we probably know them, but to actually get given the space to really change the way that we operate, because most brands we're not really connected with. And I think that's a big difference. And I think that's how we need to, work together to create that emotional connection. Because if you want to change consumption levels, we all have to work together.
Sarah, I love it. It's a beautiful, brilliant, like succinct call to arms, if you like, at the end of this particular part of the conversation. We're gonna move on to our final magic wand question here, but I just want to ask you the question: is there anything else that you think listeners out there who are considering, the choice architecture and the experiences that they provide their customers with, in light of this subject area, is there any other kind of absolute kind of best advice that you would offer for those people thinking about how to implement some of these changes?
Well, I think our roles, when you asked like how sustainability has changed, I think the best way to look at our roles is that there should be business transformation roles. And the more you can set KPIs and processes that are part of existing processes, the better. So in our case, when you work with your retailers, when it comes to the contractual negotiations, sustainability or energy efficiency is not going to part and center of it, but can you at least add a layer in terms of what is the volume of the most energy efficient appliances? Because clearly that then, drives the right behavior for everyone. So I think that's a really important piece to make sure that it isn't just something that gets spoken about, but really is part of the way that growth is being planned and delivered. So I think that's a really important piece. And the other one, I think, for me on the consumer side is, I don't think we need to get too concerned about talking about sustainability or talking about the planet or what it may be. In the end, is speak the language that people want to. So I give you an example, like because something can be human centric, but you don't have to spell out that it's sustainable. So I think it's like move away from, when we talk about like close the green gap, it doesn't really matter how you close it. So there is this tool, which is the third party tool that's really cool. It's called the UECO tool, which a lot of companies like mine use. At point of purchase, it calculates on the website for you, if you go for the most energy efficient option, what would be the financial savings over the lifetime of the product. And I remember a couple of years ago when we had the height of the energy price issues, buying a tumble dryer, and literally was like £2,000. Now, clearly, if you can, knowing there's a cost of living crisis, but if you can, of course, you'd pay a little bit extra, because clearly you're going to get that money back. And I think it's such a clever thing, because it doesn't mention the environment. It doesn't mention sustainability. This is just about your wallet. But it's so compelling. It's got like these different, gold, silver, bronze medals, and people will make the right choice. But as I said, it's the number one driver probably is not the planet, because that feels quite far removed. So you make it as relevant. You have to meet people where they are. And I think this is often in sustainability, we haven't quite managed to do that. We want them to do the right thing, but actually meet them where they are, and then you will drive change.
Sarah, I love it. And it rings so incredibly true to the conversations that we have when we talk about with guests about, sustainability isn't about being green fingered. It's about good business practice, about efficient business practice, and thinking of it in efficiency terms as opposed to environmental terms is a key way to develop the dialogue. I've loved this conversation. It's been an absolute whistle stop tour. I know we've just scratched the surface, but we have kind of hit around our 45-minute mark. Sarah, let me finish with the magic wand question. We would hand you this ever increasingly used magic wand, and you could change one thing about the commercial world this instant. What would that one thing be?
Well, I think the biggest difficulty, especially at the moment, given the global economic climate that we face, is the short-termism. And I think in the absence of pricing in carbon, it's very hard for boards and for shareholders to always reward the best sustainable strategy and decisions. And I think that is just a reality we have to face. And I think, I work for a Swedish company, which is likely protected, but in the end, that's a system within we operate. And I find that you look at a Unilever where you have activist shareholders. I think there is an increasing realization that we need to be able to price in carbon. You need to price in social externalities, because otherwise it's difficult to see that we're going to make progress as quickly as we want to. I think it's just a reality. And I think it was always true, but in increasingly very, very challenging economic circumstances, it's true more than ever.
And I love that, Sarah. And I almost feel like what you described earlier in terms of sort of the experience in 2010, joining Mars and experiencing the sustainability function, if you like, being almost separate, and that over the course of your career, it's become more and more ingrained into the core function and fabric of the businesses that you've worked with. What you've just described there is that next step, isn't it? That's obviously required imminently. Sarah, that was absolutely fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us today. Hopefully you've enjoyed yourself, and we might be able to.
Very much so. Maybe you can turn the recording off and just keep on talking.
Great stuff.